And he's going to talk about some destruction. But then we're going to go into John in July. And during July, we're going to talk about the Word, this agent of creation that you're partnering with. And then in August, we'll get to Revelation. And in Revelation, we're going to see that there's great hope for the saints. But in June, what are we going to talk about? We're going to first of all look at how God foretells the destruction that's coming. Who's it coming for? What's going to happen? What does Isaiah say about this destruction? And this is not such a fun lesson that we're going to do today. This one's really one that hones in on us, really, and makes us do some introspection, just like Isaiah was trying to get the people at that time to do some introspection. Then, next week, we'll be looking at how God, through Isaiah, foretells redemption. That's a little happier subject there. But he's going to talk about, in the future, how there's going to be some redemption. Then he's going to talk about how, in the next week, well, I think there's a week in there where we skip Vacation Bible School week. I don't know if it's that week or the next. But then Isaiah's going to talk about how God's people are going to prosper. And when is this going to come? And finally, we'll talk about the deliverance that God is going to offer. Isaiah has a lot to say here, and I'm really intrigued by Isaiah. The prophet Isaiah is one of those that actually wrote things down. Oh, there were a lot of prophets back in the olden times, and at one time there were 400 prophets, so there were a bunch of them, but not all of them wrote the things down that they were hearing from God. Isaiah did. And Isaiah, if you look at his writings, sometimes his writings even rival people like Shakespeare. So, beautiful writings. And when you think about how historical his writings are, and you think about the Dead Sea Scrolls, how those Bedouins uncovered this cave that had collapsed and found these Dead Sea Scrolls in there. And when they unrolled this 24-foot scroll, it was a 2,000-year-old scroll of what Isaiah wrote down. Amazing. And when they compared it against what we had in our Bible, it was the same. So it had been carried down from century to century to century, just like it was. Isaiah was a prophet during the time of Judah. Now, when he was a young boy, Assyria had attacked Israel and taken them off, like we were imagining China did to Canada. And during that time, it was a terrible time, but Isaiah grew up with the Assyrians right above him as a threat to Judah. And he had 4 kings that he ruled under, he spoke to for God. And those kings, most of them were good, some of them were bad. The last one that he was prophesying for, he was a bad king, and yet he helped him tremendously save Jerusalem. Because at the time, Assyria came down. Now notice I'm saying Assyria, not Babylonia, okay? Not the Babylonian Empire, but Assyria. Assyria had come down, and they had taken off and captured about 40 or more of Judah's walled cities. And they were taking people off from Judah. And yet, Isaiah was able to tell the king of Judah how to protect Jerusalem. And in fact, God helped because he sent an angel down, and this angel warded off the Assyrians, and they didn't capture Jerusalem. So a lot happens during Isaiah's time of foretelling all of this. And the prophet Isaiah was actually hearing from God. Now you notice I was telling you about Assyria. Babylon was a city, a great city in Assyria. Now, there had been wars. Babylon had been destroyed, and then it was rebuilt. When he starts making some of these predictions in chapter 47, you're going to see that he's talking about the Babylonian Empire. It's 150 years before it becomes an empire. He is predicting this in advance, and he's warning them about some things. So it's going to be very interesting how this comes about. So let's look at Isaiah 47, verse 10. He starts off, he says, "You have trusted in your wickedness and have said, 'No one sees me.' Your wisdom," that's your wisdom, "and your knowledge mislead you when you say to yourself, 'I am, and there is no one besides me.'" We're going to look at this a little closer as to what this really means. But first of all, I want to delve into this first sentence here. You have trusted in your wickedness. What do we trust in? Who do you trust? Do you trust your spouse, your kids, your police? You know, trust is something that's very hard to earn and can be lost so easily, and we know that. In fact, Elon Musk was wondering recently, on May 26th, he put out a poll, and it said, "Who do you trust less?" And this is a real question, he said. Do you trust less politicians or billionaires? Because so many people were talking about billionaires and how bad these billionaires are. So he put out this question, and 3,400,000 people answered his question. And look at the results. 75% said they trust politicians less than billionaires. Less than billionaires. So I'm sure that made him feel good, Elon Musk. But so that's part of what we saw here. You have trusted in your wickedness and have said, "No one sees me." Wickedness. What does he mean by that? Well, the Hebrew word for wickedness in the Old Testament is typically riosh, and it means guilt. But when it's used as an adjective, it's rasha, which means criminal or the guilty one, or guilty of crime. So, wickedness is described as someone who is guilty of committing a crime worthy of punishment in God's eyes. Why is it that it would be worthy of punishment in God's eyes? Does it just hurt God? Wickedness also hurts people around that person that's being wicked, but it hurts the person that's being wicked also. But this is something that is hurtful to people. So you've trusted in your wickedness. Which secret crimes, which secret sins, which secret crimes are we trusting in nowadays? You know, we want to pull these things down and look at them as far as our lives are concerned. It's great to look at the history and to learn from it, but if you don't take that and incorporate it into your life, then you've just found some interesting things. So let's look at this a little bit closer. Your wisdom and knowledge mislead you when you say to yourself, "I am, and there is none besides me." You know, you're claiming here to be apart from God, that you can stand alone without God. I trust myself. Or, I trust in my country's military might. You think Babylon, the Babylonian Empire, is going to trust in their might? Yes, they will. What about the political might? We trust, no matter how untrustworthy they are, we still trust them to put laws into effect in the United States, don't we? We trust them to go up to Congress and speak for us. How much do you trust in them? You know, When you say, I'm setting myself aside from God, that I don't need Him, I could trust in myself, that's something that's been a temptation to human beings ever since the beginning. Adam and Eve, they wanted to be like God. And so this is a dangerous thing. We trust in ourselves alone and leave God out of it. Because in Proverbs it says, all true wisdom and knowledge begin with the fear of the Lord. Okay, so we should be trusting on God. And Isaiah is telling these Babylonian people and us, as we read this, that we should be trusting in God, not just in ourselves, not in our political might, not in our armies. But he also says, no one sees me. You've trusted in your wickedness and no one sees me. And my dog did this. We would leave the house. The dog was really good. Her name was Jet. And Joan and I had only been married a year. And we would leave the apartment and we'd come home and the bed would be unmade. The toilet paper would be unrolled. And the trash can turned over, food was eaten out of the trash. And she's sitting there looking at us like she's innocent. We know it was you. No one sees me. Excuse me. Can you get away with something in your wickedness? Well, watch this. I mean, that is funny. You know, that I have never seen anything like that. A seagull coming into the store and absconding with nobody saw him, you know, but they're filming him. But do we feel like that sometimes? In our wickedness, we get away with something. We're just going to sneak in here and do this. Excuse me. Joan, do you have a... Yes, okay. No one sees me. What about this? When we take this and put this sentence into our life, what is it that we do that we hope no one sees us? Some of those secret sins, some of the wickedness, minor things. These are pretty minor, aren't they? Texting while driving. Thank you. And just look through this list. Online, anonymous, hateful messages. Joan added tax evasion here. But recently, someone tried to run a red light, and they were seen because they hit somebody else. And they caused a terrible wreck. People were taken to the hospital. And that happens a lot. So sometimes you are seen even though you're trying to get away with something. I want to go a little bit deeper into this in something that's not just minor. There was a girl named Michelle in 1979 who took a trip to just get something at the mall. She went to J.C. Penney, remember that store? And when she came out and got in her car, her life ended right then. The police came out. They found her body stabbed multiple times. She was not sexually assaulted. Her money was still in her wallet. And when they started looking for clues, why would somebody kill this young girl? She was innocent. They found no fingerprints. They found her blood, and they found some other blood on her. Apparently, she did fight back. So, at that time, 1979, there wasn't anything like DNA testing. Michelle's murder went unsolved. Someone got away with murdering Michelle. And this was in Iowa. And her parents actually died without finding any resolution to this. and this was terrible. Imagine if it had been your daughter or your son that had been killed like this, and you don't know who did it. But Isaiah continues here, 47:11, disaster will come upon you, you who rely on your wickedness and thinks no one sees you. And you will not know how to conjure it away. A calamity will fall upon you that you cannot ward off with a ransom. A catastrophe which you cannot foresee will suddenly come upon you. Now he's given some warnings to the Babylonian Empire, which isn't even existing yet. But it's also a warning to us. You know, now what is that disaster that's coming upon this person who killed Michelle? He couldn't even see it. But there came to be this open source DNA database. What's it called? 23andMe or something like that? 24andMe? I'm not good with numbers. Is it 23? 23, okay. And here this open database comes about. And now DNA from all over the world is being put into this database. And apparently, a cousin of the murderer put their DNA in that database, trying to figure out, who am I? Am I Indian or whatever? And when they put it in there, they also had a man who had not given up. Even after 30 some odd years, he had not given up trying to find that murderer. And he was in Iowa working on this, and he saw that he could take that blood drop that had landed on her clothing that wasn't hers, and he could try to match it in the database. And when he did, it came up to that cousin. Well, she was taken out of the picture because it wasn't her. But he took the family tree and he went back through this family tree and he started eliminating people. He eliminated about 80 people. And then he came down to 3 brothers. They started watching these 3 brothers. And one day, one of them was drinking out of a straw. And he took the straw and he threw it in the trash can. Anybody can get that straw now, right? So the detective goes over and picks up the straw, takes it in, tests it, it matches. It is an exact DNA match. So they arrested a man named Jerry Lynn Burns. Jerry Lynn was an Iowa resident. He had been living a quiet life after this murder. He was a family man now. And this came upon him out of the clear blue. And during the trial, they proved that it was Jerry Lynn that killed Michelle. And on August 7th, 2020, Burns was sentenced to life in prison without parole. And he's currently in the Anamosa State Penitentiary. Consequences are ahead. And that's what Isaiah was trying to tell the Babylonians in advance. But oftentimes we don't see what's happening under the surface. We have some people that are doing some minor things that are wicked, and they're not seeing other people see them, and they're not seeing any results of it. And it can rock along for quite some time. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on the next few slides that I show you, but I want those of you who know these people to understand that we didn't see anything. Oh, there were some clues. But when the arrest came, Erath County found the murderer and put him in jail where he awaits now on $500,000 bond. You know, you can hide wickedness sometimes, but consequences are coming. Isaiah was a little... Oh, wait, I want to tell you about Ministry Watch. Ministry Watch is something that I started getting a while back. Any of y'all get this email? I thought it was spam at first, and I thought, what in the world is this? This is a website that looks at churches and puts any bad thing about a church into their email and on their website and then sends it out. So if there is a preacher that is accused of sexual immorality with somebody, they put it out there. If somebody absconds with funds, like this woman, a former church administrator in California was arrested in Oklahoma, charged with wire fraud and aggravated identity theft for allegedly embezzling more than $360,000 from a California church. She was administrator there for 5 years. Chanel Easton, 36, is charged with stealing money from the food pantry and the youth ministry. This is a website called Ministry Watch. And at first, I thought, they're just trying to tell us every negative thing about churches that they can. And maybe that's what they're trying to do. I don't know. They say that they're empowering donors that are giving to Christian ministries to know what's going on under the surface. People can start to rely on the wickedness that they get away with. You think this woman was relying on that $360,000 to pay her bills and to buy things? She was relying on that, and she was getting away with it for a while. But the consequences came. One thing I like about Isaiah's writings is he uses sarcasm. And we're going to look at the next part where he's going to be a little sarcastic. And I found this definition of sarcasm. Anybody ever heard this one? The ability to insult idiots without them realizing it. It's a little crude, but there's probably some truth in that. So here Isaiah continues with 47:12. He's telling these to come Babylonian Empire people, keep on then with your magic spells and with your many sorceries, which you've labored with since childhood. Perhaps you will succeed. Perhaps you'll cause true terror. I think he's being sarcastic here. He knows it's not going to work. But he is telling them, yeah, go ahead, try this. Let's see if it works. And he continues in verse 13, all the counsel you have received has only worn you out. Let your astrologers come forward, those stargazers who make predictions month by month. Let them save you from what is coming upon you. Sarcasm. He knows this isn't going to work. So he finally wraps this up and he says, surely they are like stubble. The fire will burn them up. They can't even save themselves from the power of the flame. These are not coals that you sit by for warmth. So he knows what they're going to be relying on, and he's predicting it's not going to work. You should be relying on God. Now, he's writing all this down also, and it is something that I think is appropriate for us too, because we rely on too many other things that aren't going to work. And we really need to be putting our trust in God. And in those things, that is all they are to you. These have dealt with, that you have dealt with and labored with since childhood, all of them go on in their error. There is not one of them that can save you. Rely on God. Yet, we have so many people that turn away from God and don't rely on Him. I know you rely on God. You're here today and you're trusting God. You're praising Him for what He's done in your lives. And He's done wonderful things in your lives. Yet there are so many people that turn away. Why? I just listed some of the reasons that I could think of, 10 reasons why people don't depend on God, why they turn away. There's so many distractions nowadays. Bless you, my wife. So, yes. That's a fun thing to do. Mike wanted to know why I made everything begin with D. It's just fun. Yeah, distractions are something like, Mike, do you ever get distracted? Well, yeah. So, distractions can take us away from our love of God in our following His Word, reading His Word, studying, knowing Jesus Christ and how He came to this life and showed us how to live the right life. Those distractions can take us away so easily, and there's so many of them. I heard that if you give a man a fish, you can feed him for a day, but if you give the man the internet, you'll not see him for a year. You know, there's so many distractions that take away from God. And then there's difficulties. People turn away because sometimes it gets difficult. Of course, it's difficult studying. I remember when I was in college and Joan would wake me up, aren't you studying for a test? And I'd go, yes, I'm studying, right? And yet, it was difficult to study. It's difficult to study about God. It's difficult to get up and get dressed and be here every day, every Sunday. Those are small difficulties, but what about the big difficulties? When illnesses come and things that are hard to overcome. Some people, instead of relying more on God, will turn away from God. And then there's disappointment. You have that illness and you pray to God and you ask others to pray to God, please make this illness go away, and yet you still have to encounter it and overcome it yourself. Maybe He's given you the strength to overcome it. Maybe He's helped your body to fight it in different ways, but giving you doctors that can help. And yet some people get disappointed in God that He didn't just snap His fingers and take it away. And then there's this disgust with other Christians. Somebody lets a person down. I remember one person told me, I'm not coming to church anymore. Why? Because I looked over, and this was when I was like in high school. He said, I looked over and that older person was asleep in church. Really? So you're not going to come to church anymore because of that? Disgust with other Christians. But there have also been business deals that have hurt people financially because of mistakes that a Christian has made. Forgiveness should come into play here. And Jesus tells us to forgive, and yet disgust with other Christians can cause people to turn away. Discouragement. Mike.
Well, you were talking about disgust with other Christians. I was watching George Carlin's biography on TV, on HBO or something. It's one of those, maybe Apple, I don't know. Anyways, he didn't like Christianity because when he was 10 or 7 or 8, one of those, he had his first communion, and he was told that the Holy Spirit would come on him, and that he would have this feeling and all this stuff, which I don't know who told him any of that stuff, but none of that happened. So that was his turning point. He was disappointed and disgusted with Christianity because it didn't turn out anywhere near what he thought it was.
So, expectations of George Carlin and not coming out exactly like he thought it was going to come out can cause disappointment with God and discouragement. Okay, thank you, Mike. Some of these other things, doubt, overcoming doubt sometimes is very difficult. But it does take thinking. And I know that a lot of times I'll ask Joan what she's thinking, and she'll be thinking some deep things, And And she'll ask me what I'm thinking, and I'll tell her, and she'll go, really? Okay? I'm exaggerating, but that actually happened this morning. And then there's the drifting away. COVID could cause people to drift away because we could have people that find, I found something else to do instead of Sunday morning worship. I found a TV show I like a lot. Drifting away. It can take little interruptions that cause people to drift away. And then there's the distance. Distance from other people. When we had to keep 6 feet away from everybody, it seemed kind of ridiculous. Then it became 3 feet. And then finally we could hug again. Wasn't it great when you could actually shake hands again and be close to someone? You don't want to be too close. That's some people are too close. But it was great to be able to be close again. And the distance sometimes can make people drift away. And then there's deceit. When you do have people that are being deceitful, like the woman that we saw, or the many others that I saw listed in that website, Christians in name and yet being deceitful and hiding their wickedness, and then finally being found out, well, you deceived me. And just like George Carlin said, I don't want anything to do with that anymore because I was deceived. And also, God's timing is sometimes hard to understand. When John Clayton explained it like, we find it very difficult to understand God because it's like the analogy of flatland. Remember the flatland analogy? Anybody remember that? If you lived in flatland and a sphere came and the sphere approached your flatland and all you saw are these two dimensions, and the sphere touched flatland, it would look like a dot. And you would think, I understand that. God is a dot. But if God was approaching as a sphere in flatland, as he approached further, he would become a circle and then a bigger circle. And that's all you could see would be a circle. And then the circle got bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it got smaller and smaller and smaller until it was a dot again as it passed through. But still, the people in flatland had no concept of what a sphere was. They could only see this or that, so we have trouble sometimes understanding God, and we never will, I don't think, until we see him face to face. But understanding his timeline is also difficult because we're finite and he's infinite. So how do we understand how he looks at time? The cold case of Michelle. Her parents died without knowing that Jerry Burns was caught. I'm sure it was very difficult for them to understand how could this take so long? Why would it go unsolved? And yet it was. When you see that the consequences did come and he was put in jail, that's good. He got what he deserved. There will be many people that are wicked, and so wicked that we look at them and say, why are they being successful and they're so wicked? And yet on God's time, they will find the consequences.
There's the same situation talked about her. Happened over in here in the Dallas area. There was a woman over at Creekside Church of Christ that was murdered inside the building. And they have yet to find out, but eventually they will find out who did it. It's still cold files.
Coal files are so tough. In Creekside, where she was murdered, that's a sad situation. On God's time, they will be punished. Isaiah predicted salvation in God's timing. But it's going to take years. Babylonian Empire is 150 years away. A lot's going to happen in between. Christians need to trust in God's plan. And we're going to talk more about that, how God is going to right all wrongs. But next week, we'll go a little bit further into what Isaiah predicts. And we'll see things aren't all bad. There's going to be some good things coming that Isaiah predicts. But today, we talked about the destruction that's coming upon Babylonian Empire. And then, we need to have faith in God. Other things are going to disappoint us. When he's talking about looking into the stars and the stargazers or the predictors that are so wrong, don't depend on things that we talked about that they depend on, but depend on God. Partners in a new creation. The old things are going to be done away with, and there's going to be a new creation. That's what he's going to talk about. So, this first month, God delivers and restores. Today we talked about destruction, but God foretells next week about redemption. And we'll continue looking at Isaiah there. So, I want you to go away knowing a little bit in advance. I want you to know that you are a new creation. And you're partners with God in that. So we'll talk more about that next week and then the week after. But now, let's do some introspection and think about, are we relying on too many of the things that we shouldn't rely on, as opposed to relying on God? Let's help those that have drifted away, that have felt deceit in the church. Let's help those to see that they should be relying on God and bringing them back. Okay? Let's bow for a word of prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for bringing Isaiah's words to us through the centuries. Thank you for the Bible, that you have brought your word to us down through these ages so that we can see how we are to live this life, that we can see your promises, that we can see how other people have gone wrong and how some have been punished here, some have been punished later, but yet, Lord, you are our God and you rule this universe. We thank you for the love that you have shown us. Father, we especially pray for those who have lost loved ones this week. Be with Betty Terry's family and comfort them. Thank you for bringing her home. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.